Hello everybody and welcome to week 7. This is the week 7 lecture for the course on action research for children at risk in community contexts. And this week we're going to move on to the next stage after the critical literature review and look at designing the research methodology. But before that, let's quickly review what we have done so far. We began with identifying the research problem, which was the one problem that you had chosen out of many that was important both for you as well as the stakeholders of your research context that you chose to address through this action research project. Then you went on to abstract a theme out of the problem, which is the concept that is at the center of your research project. Last week, you did a literature review on the theme and you surveyed the literature that has been written on this particular theme until now. And while you were doing that, you looked to identify the debates, the different theories, and the theoretical positions that were held on this particular theme. Finally, you reviewed the literature on the thematic with a view to understanding the debate as well as the different concepts and theories associated with the thematic. Now that you have done the critical literature review, we come to the exciting part of the research journey, where we get to design the methodology of our action research project, which will catapult you for the next few weeks into the field where you would personally be conducting these action interventions. At the onset, let me say that research methodologies and designs are unique to the research context as well as to the researcher herself. There is no one way to do it. Each of you will have a unique approach and design. In action research projects, research designs seek to serve two main purposes. First of all, it's a plan of action for you to fulfill your interventions in the research context. You've identified a problem and now you're creating a plan to address it in the particular organization that you are a part of. Secondly, it's also a plan to collect data even as you carry out your interventions. Remember, action research always has these two different foci. On the one hand, action in the real world to resolve a problem, while on the other hand, it's also research, which is at this stage meant to collect data which will be later analyzed to find answers to the questions you have begun with. So let me begin with the general structure of a research design for action research projects. I will also reflect on my own research journey and share from my experience of doing action research. In my view, an action research project in its design has 7 components. So let's begin with the first component. It begins with a central research question you have articulated after the literature review. Now this is important because at the heart of your project is your research question. And all that you do is towards answering this question. So the design begins with the question, as it is the answering of this question that the project is all about. Secondly, restate the question as a research aim. For example, a recent research question I had can be articulated as this: how do local traditions mediate development interventions within a community? So this was a question that I had. It is a research question that I worked with in a recent project. And I must mention in passing that the wording of this question is influenced by the literature review, particularly the review I did on the idea of tradition and the dialogue of traditions. So the language of tradition and the various theories associated with it have come from my critical literature review. So the question can now be restated as this following research aim. The aim of this research project is to find out how development interventions are mediated by the local traditions within the Bhatki community in Vidarbha. So that was my aim. I wanted to find this out. How did this particular community in Vidarbha, which is in Maharashtra, India, how did they use their own local traditions to mediate the development interventions that were brought to them? So once the aim is clearly stated, we need to write out the research objectives that need to be fulfilled for this aim to be achieved. So for this particular research aim that I had for Vidarbha, we can think of 3 research objectives. The first objective is to deconstruct the development intervention using the structure of tradition to identify 3 different things. So often development agencies would have an intervention, whether it's water conservation or education or health, but they look at it as purely action, something to benefit the community. Now what I did as a researcher is I set up an objective to deconstruct their development initiative or intervention into 3 parts. Number 1, the mindset and the worldview behind that intervention. If someone was to obtain and buy in to that development intervention, then what sort of mindset and worldview is required? Number 2, this particular intervention, what knowledge is required to actually practice this intervention, to obtain this intervention? What knowledge content is being supplied? And thirdly, what skills and practices are required to implement the intervention? So what practices, what actions do the community have to do to implement this development intervention? So these 3 components are inbuilt into a development intervention, and my first objective was to take it out, to look at it and tease it out. The second objective is to use the same structure of tradition framework to map the community's dominant local traditions in terms of 4 different parts. So now that I've understood the development intervention, let's map the community to find out where they are. Some could even call it that this is a form of a baseline survey. But this is not merely looking for the economic status or their material welfare, but we're using the lens of traditions, and therefore this baseline survey is to find out where this community is in terms of their beliefs and practices. So 4 things. Number 1, their narratives and texts that they hold dear, that they value. And again, remember, keep that development intervention in mind, because this community might have many narratives and texts, but remember, you're always trying to connect it in your head with the intervention that you want to bring to them. Number 2, their practices. These practices could be everyday practices this community does. They could be festival practices or yearly practices, annual practices, or these could also be practices that someone does through their different stages of their life. So the different practices that are important for the community. Number 3, their rationality, the way they think, their worldview or their mindset. And finally, number 4, the community's goals, aspirations, dreams. And in all this, we are trying to align the development intervention in its language. So now that we have got these informations about the community, we have understood, we have mapped them, we are now trying to understand the development intervention in the language of the community. And that's a very creative work. We're trying to understand how this community would understand education or water or fertility of soil. And then the final third objective is to implement the cycles of development intervention mediated through the community's resources or local traditions, even while we observe and reflect on the process of this mediated implementation. This is the heart of the research design, where we are able to implement as well as observe and collect data on how the implementation process took place. Fourthly, the research philosophy. Your research philosophy consists of your epistemological position, how you understand the world, how you understand knowledge. There are various positions or schools ranging from a positivist, a realist position to a constructivist or a postmodern position. A little reading on these various schools will be useful. Action research generally believes in co-construction of knowledge through a dialogical process. And this kind of lies in somewhere in the middle between positivism and a complete postmodern constructive worldview. So it'll be good to do a bit of reading and state what is your position, what is your epistemological position. Number 5, the research strategy. And here our research strategy very clearly is action research. In an action research project, it's not just about collecting data, but as you know, it's actually about enacting actions that bring about change and transformation. In my case, the process consisted of 3 broad cycles. In the first cycle, it was for me to build a development worldview and mindset in the community using the community's rationality and mindset that they already had. By doing this, I was not imposing or thrusting a development worldview upon them, but actually working from where they were thinking, what they thought, working from that point in order for them to understand the development intervention. Secondly, to impart the new knowledge of the development intervention, but this time mediated through the community's own narratives and texts. So all the stories I had asked of them in my initial baseline survey and found out from them, I was now using these stories, these insights about the community to mediate the development intervention. So helping them to understand this new development inputs in their own language, in their own thought processes. Thirdly, to build upon the community's practices. It's not that the community is just sitting idle. They already have a few practices that we mapped. Now building on these practices to help them to take on new practices of development that would implement the intervention that was being brought to the community. So what did an action intervention cycle look like in my work? It began with this intervention planning. For each cycle, I spent time with my team to plan an intervention. In this planning, I was able to rethink the development initiative in light of the community's knowledge, in light of the local tradition. Number 2, we had focused groups we brought together who were the community's change makers. And what we did was we worked with them and we implemented the action with them. From our end, it was a time of discussion, learning together, and from their end, once they had worked with us, they would go and implement it in their particular areas. So suppose if it's on farming, then we would discuss that particular step of the intervention together in the focus group. And after we have done, they would go and they would practice it. They would implement it in their fields. They would share it with their fellow farmers in the village. And thirdly, they would come back and give reflective feedback. Now this was crucial because maybe we thought we knew how it should be implemented, but in practice, they have knowledge how precisely it can be done. Some things just will not work at ground zero, and some work really well. And this knowledge of what works and what doesn't work comes from these farmers. Now they might be the recipient of development, they might be poor, but in their context, they hold a central position to arbitrate what works and what doesn't work. So their reflective feedback is the new knowledge that you as a researcher is collecting. And now what do you do with it? You review, you evaluate, you tweak, and that stage is called review and evaluation. And finally, in the last stage, you design a new intervention. And this new intervention is based on the reflective feedback from the community, as well as it's based on the review and evaluation that you have done as a researcher. So this cycle continues on. And sometimes it's just taking one point of intervention and going through multiple cycles so that you could better that intervention. But often we don't have time, so usually we divide our intervention into 3 doable parts, and each cycle entails or contains the acting out of one part. I leave it up to you to design your action research cycles. I will not prescribe how you should do it, but you could take a very small, just one step and do 3 weeks of repeated cycles, or you could take 3 different steps and do a week each on them. That's totally up to you. Number 6, don't forget, you're here as a researcher to collect data. So the collection of data needs to be meticulous. You must already set up systems and structures of how you're going to do it. You collect data at all stages of doing the action research cycle, always keeping the central research question in mind. Let me emphasize this one point. There's plenty of data to be collected, but not all of them are going to be useful. The only data that's going to really be useful is the one that relates to your research question. But while you're with the community, you're going to be facing a new world. A lot of interesting things are going to jump at you, and it might even excite you. Various streams and strands of thoughts. But remember, keep the focus. Try to answer your research question and collect data that's valuable for that question. You can use different methods like focus group discussions, interviews, personal interviews, surveys if you want to add a quantitative side to it, and just plain observation. So keep a diary, note down your observations. They're a good source as primary data for your research. And finally, the 7th part of your research design script is the research ethics statement. This is in order for you to protect yourself as a researcher, that no harm comes to you while you're intervening in organizations and communities' lives. And on the other hand, it's also to protect your respondents, that even as they share sensitive information, that they are protected. And finally, the community or the organization you're working with, that they too are protected. So you need to look at various forms of doing research ethics statement, and I suggest that you choose one that's suitable for your research context. So, in conclusion, you can use the 7-part research design format to write your script. But remember, it's not just the script that's being written that's important, but it's also a time for you to think through your project even as you prepare to go to the field for implementation. So good luck with writing your research design methodology script, and have a lovely week. Bye now.